Ladies and gentlemen, today we commemorate Yom Hazikaron 2021 at Congregation Beth Yeshurun. Due to the difficult circumstances we are facing today, our ceremony will be virtual. Today, on the eve of the Day of Remembrance for the fallen soldiers and the victims of terror, we are one in solidarity. Together, we remember those who are not with us anymore. This year, as part of our ceremony, we chose to highlight the sacrifices of Israel's lone soldiers who were killed during their service. At this time, we will commence with the ceremony. A memorial candle will be lit by a representative of the FIDF. Sergeant Dylan Selzer served as a corporal in the Israeli Defense Forces and was a lone soldier himself. At this time, I would like to welcome Mr. Ohad Netzer, IAC Houston's Regional Manager, to read the Yizkor.
יזכור. יזכור עם ישראל את בניו ובנותיו, הנאמנים והאמיצים, חיילי צבא ההגנה לישראל, וכל לוחמי המחתרות וחטיבות הלוחמים במערכות העם, ואנשי קהילות המודיעין, הביטחון, המשטרה ושירות בתי הסוהר, אשר חירפו נפשם במלחמה על תקומת ישראל, וכל מי שנרצחו בארץ ומחוצה לה בידי מרצחים מארגוני הטרור. יזכור ישראל ויתברך בזרעו ויאבל על זיו העלומים וחמדת הגבורה וקדושת הרצון ומסירות הנפש אשר הנספים במערכה הכבדה. יהיו חללי מערכות ישראל עטורי הניצחון חתומים בלב ישראל לדור דור.
For the reading of the Kaddish prayer, I would like to welcome Mr. Alon Carmeli, father of fallen soldier, Texas-born Sean Carmeli. Sergeant Carmeli from South Padre Island went to Israel to fight for his country. He was a Golani Brigade fighter killed July 20th, 2014 in Gaza. He was only 21 years old. Mr. Carmeli is joining us from a synagogue in Tiberias, Israel.
יתגדל ויתקדש שם רבה. אמן. וילמד מדברי קירותי, ומליך מלכותי, יצמח פורקנה ויקרב משיחי. אמן. וחייכון וביומכון חיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. אמן. שם רבה ועולם המיה. לעולם לעלמי העלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שאמת וקודשה בריחו. אמן. לעילה מנקוד ברכתה, שירתה, ברכתה בנחמתה, דאמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. על ישראל ועל רבנן ועל תלמידי הון ועל כל תלמידי תלמידי הון יעסקים לאורייתא קדישתא די ואתרא עדן ודי בכל אתר ואתר יהיה לנו ולנו לבחון חינם וחסדה ורחמים ונקודם מראה שמאיה והרעה ויראו אמן. יהיה שלמה רבה מן שמאיה חיים ושבע וישועה ונחמה וזלפה ורפואה וגאולה וסליחה וכפרה ורווח והצלה לנו וכל עמו ישראל ויאמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו וברחמיו ויעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל ויאמרו אמן.
At this time, I would like to welcome Cantor of Congregation Beth Yeshurun, Cantor Meir Finkelstein, to recite the El Maleh Rachamim prayer.
El Maleh Rachamim shulchein b'mromim, Hamtzei menucha nechona al kanfei hashchina, במעלות קדושים וטהורים וגיבורים כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים לנשמות כל אלה שנלחמו בכל מערכות ישראל במחתרת ובצבא ההגנה לישראל ושנפלו במלחמתם ומסרו נפשם על קדושת השם העם והארץ בעבור שאנו מתפללים לעילוי נשמותיהם יסתירם בסתר כנפיים מצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וגן עדן מנוחתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבותם, ותעמוד לכל ישראל זכותם, ויעמדו לגורלם לקץ הימים, ונאמר
At this time, I would like to welcome Senior Rabbi of Congregation Beth Yeshurun, Rabbi Brian Strauss, to share some remarks.
Thank you. We here at Beth Yeshurun are again honored to have this Yom Hazikaron ceremony here in our congregation. When I take congregants of Beth Yeshurun to Israel, we always make sure to meet lone soldiers. Not only are their stories inspiring, but it's a reminder to all of our young that we take on our trips that they too can make this incredible commitment. It's a choice for our young Jews growing up in places like Houston, and for those that make that commitment to spend their years in Israel fighting for the defense of Medinat Yisrael. Their stories of bravery and courage are always inspiring. I've always wondered, where does that incredible commitment that these new Israelis coming from the United States, where does that commitment come from? Where do lone soldiers from the United States and all over the Jewish world, where does that commitment come from? Perhaps we can look to the Torah. In the Torah, we see the story right before Jacob is going to die. And the Torah tells us when the time approached for Jacob to die, he summoned his son Joseph and said to him, "Do me this favor. Place your hand under my thigh as a pledge of your steadfast loyalty. Do not bury me in Egypt." Instead, Jacob asked his son Joseph that when he dies, don't bury him in Egypt, but instead take my body and bury me in the land of Israel. My colleague and friend, Rabbi Scott Bolton, offers the following commentary that I think gives us some wisdom of why Joseph had to make this pledge to his father Jacob. He writes, "Burying our loved ones leads to closure on the one hand, and yet opens our minds and hearts in other ways. Jacob returned Joseph to Israel to effect tikkun, deep healing, and asking his son for the truest kindness of laying his body to rest. Jacob turned the terrain of terror into a vessel of family peace and spiritual connectivity. The holy soil and rocky hills, the burial cave we can visit to this day, would receive his father. The bones of grandparents and great-grandparents would remind him and us, you belong here. You are part of this godly story." Questions abound at funerals and especially at burials. What shall we do with the rest of our time on this earth? How will we connect to the legacy of those who came before us? Shall I demand of myself to go up to the land of Israel now, physically, or on a soul level? For Joseph, no longer would Jacob be the faithful pit. Israel would no longer be that place of dread. Jacob helped him see clearly that the land belongs to his family, and it is central to the Jewish people's destiny. Ultimately, Joseph would say to his brothers, "God will indeed remember you, and you will bring my bones up from here." Jacob and Joseph teach us that diaspora existence is not complete without physical and spiritual connections to the land of Israel and to those whose bodies and bones are part of the soil. Lone soldiers remind us of that diaspora connection to the land of Israel. that without that physical and spiritual connection to Eretz Yisrael and Medinat Yisrael, the soul of the Jewish people would not survive. To those lone soldiers, those we have lost, and those who continue to fight, those who have retired from their army service and continue to inspire us, to all of you, we thank you for your service, and we thank you for your inspiration and reminder that we are all connected to the land of Israel.
I would now like to welcome Ms. Carrie Dunn-Saratovsky, President and CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Houston, to recite the poem titled, "The Young Dead Soldiers Do Not Speak," written by Archibald MacLeish.
The young soldiers who died will not speak, and will hear them nonetheless. The voice is strong and piercing, and it speaks to me and to you, to all. And it calls out the pain of wounds inflicted, and the darkness of the senses, and the nothingness of blood. And it calls out the books that will go unread, and the movies that will go unseen, and the love that will never be known. It calls out the brothers and sons and wife and his mother, to whom none will return, and the smell and the color and the taste that will never be tasted. And it is the voice that simply answers the questions, and it is the voice that knows better than we how to understand homeland, Eretz, and nation. The soldiers have given us this with their dying breath. The young soldiers who died will not speak, and will hear them nonetheless. And we who stand facing their names and bidding farewell to their dust must swear that there is truth in the testament that leave us, and that we will live life as they have commanded us to do by their deaths. For the sake of these dead, for the sake of these who live, for the sake of the beautiful dreams that have chased away the nightmares, for the sake of future days that are clearer, more wondrous, and more pure.
At this time, I would like to welcome Consul General Gilad Katz, the Consul General of Israel to the Southwest, to share some remarks.
Dear bereaved families, my fellow brothers and sisters from the Jewish community here in Houston, friends of Israel and the Jewish people, on this sacred day when Israel is celebrating its official Yom Hazikaron Memorial Day, we here in the Israeli consulate remember all the brave soldiers who sacrificed their lives so that we and generations to come can live safely and securely in the Jewish state. We cherish the fallen and admire the bereaved families who will forever pay the ultimate price for our liberty and freedom. It is important that, especially on this day, we express our thoughts and feelings to the families. We will never forget your loved ones. And we know that the Jewish people will always appreciate your endless contribution to the people and the land of Israel. This year, I thought it would be appreciate to focus and concentrate on the enormous contribution of what is known as Chayalim Bodedim, lone soldiers. This extraordinary and blessed program is unique. There is no other army in the world that willingly and systematically recruits foreigners to all its security forces. The state of Israel does not only allow young foreign Jewish adults to be drafted to the IDF, it encourages them, these young Zionist idealist individuals, to volunteer to combat units, and many of them serve in our most secret and special units. But it does not stop there. The IDF, as a policy, recommends and helps any lone soldier who desires so to become an officer in the IDF. The only true way to grasp the magnitude scale of the lone soldier program is by giving numbers and figures. So listen to this. Every year during the last decade, more than 3,000 lone soldiers from many dozens of countries and Jewish communities voluntarily decided to enlist and be drafted to Tzahal, the IDF, annually. If we look at the broader picture, we can say with no doubt and with a lot of pride that since 2011, over 30,000 lone soldiers served in the IDF army. In military standards, this number is equivalent to 10 divisions. Thousands of these lone soldiers were recruited to combat units, and hundreds of them became officers. Try to imagine what it means for a young adult who decides he or she wants to be drafted to the IDF. Think of the meaning of such a significant decision. Every year, around 3,000 young Jewish adults decide to leave their comfort zone, leave home, leave their family, friends, and change their way of life. They do so for one main reason and purpose: to fulfill their dream and beliefs and partake their duty in protecting the one and only Jewish state. Allow me to share with you the story of one lone soldier. 54 years ago, a young, idealist South African Jewish boy came to his loving parents just one day after his graduation and told them he made up his mind to leave for Israel and be recruited to the IDF. His parents, who were passionate Zionist activists, tried to persuade him to change his plans. They used every trick in the book, but nothing changed that stubborn boy's mind. To make a long story short, the boy left his family, arrived to Israel, learned a couple of years in a yeshiva, and in 1966 he volunteered to the elite unit of Tzalchanim, paratroopers. Less than a year after he was drafted, he took part in the difficult and dangerous battles of the Six-Day War in Yerushalayim. Some of his close friends were killed right next to him while they were storming into the old city. He was one of the first soldiers who got to the Kotel, to the Wailing Wall. Many years later, he told his family that those minutes, hours, days were one of the highlights of his life. After he finished his military service and was released, he was positioned in the paratroopers reserve forces. For over 20 years, this once lone soldier was recruited year after year for 1 month military service. Winter or summer, after having 7 kids, whenever he was called for duty, he left everything behind and joined his unit. Only when he celebrated his 40th birthday, was he discharged from the reserves due to age. This young adult was my dear father. 6 months ago, on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, my beloved dad unfortunately passed away. I can say from firsthand that until his last breath, my dad was extremely proud of the decision he made almost 60 years earlier to volunteer to the IDF and serve as a lone soldier. He always used to tell us that if he had to choose one decision that had most impact on his life, it would be, with no doubt, that decision. Due to that decision, he met my mother. Due to that decision, he raised my siblings and myself and taught us that when we will be when it will be our turn to be recruited to the IDF to protect our country, we should do it with joy and happiness. He always used to tell us that becoming a Jewish soldier was a dream of generations and generations of Jews. As an Orthodox Jew, my dad taught us that it is a profound mitzvah to serve the IDF and safeguard the Jewish state and the Jewish people. My dad was proud. All his 4 boys were recruited to combat units. I personally followed his giant footsteps and volunteered, just as my dad did, to the Tzanchanim, the paratroopers. For my dad, it was like living a dream. A few years ago, his first grandchildren were drafted to the IDF, and they too were serving in combat units. As we speak, one of my dad's grandsons is in the army, and two of the other grandchildren, one of them, my oldest son, are due to be recruited to the IDF in the coming months. I mentioned my dad's story, our family's story, because this is the story in many different versions of thousands and thousands of Jewish families from all the Jewish communities in the diaspora. Unfortunately, many of the lone soldiers were killed during their military service. It is our duty not only to remember their sacrifice, but we are obligated in cherishing their legacy of Zionism, contributing to the society, paving a way for future generations, and allowing us to live in a thriving, prosperous Jewish state. We should never take our good fortune in granted. That is why it is so important for me to stand here today and to recognize all the fallen soldiers and their families. We must do all in our power to support the bereaved families. It is our duty to continue the legacy of their loved ones. May the precious souls of all IDF soldiers rest in peace. Amen.
I would now like to welcome back to the stage Sergeant Selzer to share his personal experience serving as a lone soldier in Israel.
Shalom, my name is Dylan Selzer, and I served as a sergeant in the Israeli Defense Forces. More specifically, I was a lone soldier serving as a tank driver in the 53rd Battalion of the 188th Armored Brigade. A lone soldier is a soldier in the IDF with no family in Israel to support him or her. A lone soldier can be a new immigrant, a volunteer from abroad, an orphan, or an individual from a broken home. As a new volunteer in the Israeli Defense Forces, I didn't speak a word of Hebrew. Luckily, the IDF welcomed me with open arms by sending me to a special base called Mikveh Alon, where lone soldiers are immersed into the culture of the Israeli army. We studied Hebrew and did a whole lot of push-ups. In just 3 months, I went from barely being able to order a falafel to being qualified to drive a tank. Aside from the obvious language difficulties, lone soldiers are forced to cope with many other challenges. IDF soldiers in combat units typically serve a 12 days on, 2 days off schedule, meaning 2 weeks on base and 1 weekend at home. For most Israeli soldiers, this weekend at home means a weekend to relax and enjoy a restful Shabbat with your family that can also help with everyday chores, such as laundry and preparing Shabbat dinner. The soldiers' families also serve as a support system by understanding the hardships a soldier endures during the 2 weeks he or she was on base. In the case of most lone soldiers like myself, this weekend off means rushing to buy groceries before Shabbat, preparing food for yourself, and doing laundry for 2 weeks' worth of army clothes, all the while trying to catch up on sleep before returning back to base first thing Sunday morning. Even with all the hardships that coincide with being a lone soldier, thanks to the warm nature of the Israeli people and the generosity of the FIDF, I, along with many other lone soldiers, are given the much-needed support to focus our efforts and energies solely on our duties as soldiers. Not a weekend went by in my service that I was not invited over to one of my fellow soldiers' homes for Shabbat, and on weekends that I went back to my own home, I was provided with a stipend to one of the larger Israeli grocery stores, courtesy of the FIDF. There is a reason the IDF is considered one of the best armies in the world. The training was grueling. The worst of it was War Week. I'll spare the major details, but simply put, for an entire week we were cramped in a tank and not allowed to step outside as we simulated a week in a warlike environment. When we finally got back to base, you can imagine how badly we needed a shower. The base was heaven compared to the tank. These things that we usually take for granted were truly appreciated, and it was all thanks to the friends of the IDF who donated these things to better our base. It makes it so much easier to go through the challenges of War Week when we feel support like this from communities such as this one. Small comforts like care packages and holiday stipends make a huge difference in the life of an Israeli soldier. It gives our bodies and spirits a boost that is so badly needed and rejuvenates us so we can do our job of defending our homeland. We are extremely thankful for the support from FIDF and the Jews around the world who are relying on us to keep Israel safe. One of my fondest memories of my time in Israel was seeing the shift from Yom Hazikaron to Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israeli Independence Day. Having been in Israel on Yom Hazikaron for several years, I have seen firsthand the deep appreciation and somber emotions expressed throughout the country for their fallen soldiers. It is also no coincidence that in Israel, Yom Hazikaron, which is the saddest and perhaps the most difficult day of the year, is immediately followed by Yom Ha'atzmaut, the most joyous and festive day of the year. Israelis recognize and appreciate that it is because of the soldiers' deep sacrifice and commitment to protecting the homeland that the Jewish people are able to prosper and live freely in the land of Israel. Today, we recognize the great sacrifice of our fallen soldiers. Like myself, I know there are many in our community who understand firsthand the unique commitment demonstrated by lone soldiers, and I'm honored to tribute to those brave men and women today who previously served or are currently serving in the IDF as lone soldiers. Thank you.
To conclude our ceremony, I would like to welcome Ms. Yael Miller to the stage to lead us in Israel's national anthem, the Hatikva. Here's to hoping that next year we will be able to commemorate together in person.